Elliot Ditmars, Salamander Consultant. Part 3. Augie's day just keeps getting weirder and weirder. Alice took another sip of her tea and heard the creak of floorboards behind her. She smiled into her cup. Morning. She was met with silence. The floor stopped creaking and she could feel her husband patiently waiting behind her. She imagined his teasing smile. Alice turned and looked over her shoulder to see Elliot standing, arms crossed and smiling, waiting patiently for Alice to speak, like he was waiting for a code word. Which, to be fair, he sort of was. Alice rolled her eyes and said, "Salvi, mi meritus pulcher." Elliot, who was dressed in a Roman tunic and sandals — togas were too formal for breakfast, Alice guessed — broke into a brilliant smile. "Clare te salute uxor, clare, clare et cum gaudio." Alice reached up, grasped Elliot by his tunic, and pulled him down into a kiss. She thought briefly about mentioning how much she loved him and his goofiness, but the prospect of translating into Latin was a little too daunting this early on a Tuesday. If there was a secret to the success of Alice and Elliot's marriage, not that anyone asked, but if someone ever did, Alice was ready to tell them, it was their willingness to jump instantly and with total commitment and to brace an idea no matter how goofy or poorly thought out it was. While having tea with her friend Ayla a few months ago, for instance, Alice had found herself offering to fast with her through the upcoming month of Ramadan, even though she herself wasn't Muslim. Ayla gratefully took her up on it, and Alice unexpectedly found herself telling her husband that starting in a few days she wouldn't be eating or drinking anything between sunrise and sunset for the next month. Given that he was Elliot, Alice wasn't particularly surprised when he immediately committed to fasting with her and her friend Ayla, who he had met exactly once while grocery shopping. By the end of the day, there was a calendar on the kitchen wall with the exact time of sunrise and sunset marked out for the duration of Ramadan. So it made for a certain amount of sense, from a consistency point of view anyway, that Alice had gone all in with Elliot as he learned to speak Latin. No, she wasn't willing to dress like an ancient Roman, or a medieval nun for that matter, nor was she willing to eat like one. Looking up garum quickly put an end to that idea. But when Elliot told her that he needed to become fluent in classical Latin as quickly as possible for a secret project of his, she was willing to go as far as reasonably possible down the full immersion route. She listened to podcasts in Latin with him and helped him translate inscriptions on monuments, and yes, even spoke exclusively in Latin for at least 3 hours a day. She was willing to geek out that much for the coolest, well, in her nerdy estimation, the coolest husband in the world. So, Alice was happy to tell her husband to look for the orange juice on the tabulatum inferius refrigeratori. 8 months later. Auggie could hear it when the fire changed. There'd been the usual fire sounds, snaps, whooshes, and a background crackling sound in the trees and brush around him. And the wind had changed, blowing smoke and ashes into his face. The grove of trees he was in ignited and went up with a whoosh. That's when he lost track of his crew. He couldn't hear the grunts and swearing of his fellow convicts or the barked instructions from the bosses. The wind blew a fresh load of hot ash into his face, and he gasped with surprise, which meant that he got a lungful of smoke. He painfully straightened out his back and stood upright and discovered that he had been separated from the rest of the men. Auggie was alone in a world of flames, ashes, and exploding trees. He was beginning to think that this was not worth the $8 a day he was getting paid for fire duty. It was when the birds stopped singing that he began to suspect he was doomed. For the whole morning, from the time he and the other cons had piled out of the back of the truck and were assigned their shovels and pulaskis, Auggie had been struck by how much birdsong there was, fire or no fire. He'd heard once that in this part of the country, a person was surrounded on all sides, at all times, by thousands and thousands of birds. Most of them were just super good at hiding and minding their own business most of the time, so you never really noticed them or even thought of them. Today, though, every one of those tens of thousands of birds were screaming out as loud as they could. Hey, did you know that everything is on fire? Is it on fire over there? It's super burny over here. Auggie was not a sentimental man, and life had kicked most of the poetry and whimsy he might have had at one point right out of him. When you came down to it, he suspected most birds were probably as dumb as most people. He shrugged. That didn't mean they deserved to get burned up, though. It was when he realized he couldn't hear any birds anymore that he decided that he was probably screwed. The noise around Auggie faded away briefly, almost like the wildfire was taking a deep breath. Hey, look at that. Maybe he did still have a thimbleful of poetry left in him after all. Auggie wasn't technically his real name, but it had been years since even he had called himself anything other than that. His first wife, Carol, had been Catholic and had nicknamed him after St. Augustine of Hippo, the unofficial patron saint of poor life choices. Given where he was at the moment, Auggie had to admit that Carol had probably nailed that one. He wondered where she was, and he hoped that life had treated her better than he had. Just as his thoughts started taking a turn for the morbid, Auggie heard something that sounded suspiciously like a helicopter, though he was pretty sure that no pilot would be crazy enough to risk flying in the smoke and unpredictable updrafts from the fire. A dumper plane and a couple of 1,000 feet up? Yeah, probably. A helicopter? Even fighter pilots weren't that unhinged. A lifetime of being wrong about things tempered Auggie's surprise a moment or two later when the outline of a helicopter actually did appear over what was left of the tree line, and hovered more or less directly over the small clearing where he stood. As Auggie watched with a growing sense of what the two ropes tumbled out from the side of the chopper. A figure wearing a fireproof suit and a respirator worked its way down one of them. The other lowered a battered metal crate about the size of a sofa. The figure in the fire suit touched down, unhooked his, well, Auggie was pretty sure it was a man, his safety harness, and guided the crate to the ground as gently as he could manage. He unhooked the harness on the crate and tugged a couple of times on the rope. The two ropes were pulled up into the helicopter, and then, to Auggie's distress and amazement, the guy on the ground waved the chopper away, and it flew off. The guy by the crate looked around and, seeing Auggie, waved him over. He pointed to the latches on the top and along one side of the crate. Still coughing up sooty phlegm, Auggie ran, crouched over, and helped him unfasten the latches. The guy in the fire suit pulled his respirator off and offered it to Auggie, who was not going to say no to some breathable air. The guy, it turned out to be a guy after all, coughed as the hot, sooty air hit him, and he smiled and nodded. "Nice day," he observed, and then introduced himself as Elliot. He pulled open the crate to reveal the absolute last thing Auggie would have expected to see. Seriously, he would have been no less amazed if this guy Elliot had pulled the front line of the Rockettes out of the crate than what was actually in there. A giant salamander about the size of a German shepherd. "This is Bernice!" Elliot yelled over the noise of the flames, which had started back up. Elliot held out his hand to Auggie as if asking him for something. Reluctantly, the older man took one more deep breath, then handed back the respirator. It wasn't like Auggie was particularly selfless or anything, but this guy had literally just given him the breath of life, and Auggie wasn't going to screw over somebody like that. Elliot nodded his thanks, coughed, and then took 4 or 5 deep breaths from the respirator, then handed it back to Auggie, who had never been so grateful for anything in his life. The guy Elliot bent over and, to Auggie's quickly eroding sense of amazement, started shouting to the lizard. Salamander. Whatever. It wasn't English. It sounded a little like Spanish, maybe Italian? A faint memory itched in the back of Auggie's brain. What was that language that priests used to speak? Vulcan, Vatican, something like that. "Tempus est edendi puella pulcia," Elliot shouted. "Ede omnia." The words didn't mean anything to Auggie, but clearly they did to the lizard thing, which looked up at Elliot, blinked slowly once or twice with transparent eyelids, and then waddled out of its crate towards the nearest flames. Elliot knelt on the ground next to the... what had he called her? Bernice? and put his hand on its shoulder. She slowly opened her mouth, and for a moment Auggie wondered if something was supposed to happen. After a few seconds, though, he felt a hot breeze on the back of his neck. He noticed that the flames in the underbrush were starting to lean towards the salamander, just barely at first, then stronger and more pronounced as the seconds passed. Elliot turned his head and shouted something to Auggie over his shoulder. Auggie pulled the respirator off long enough to shout, "What?" But the roar of the flames was picking up again. Elliot shouted something again that Auggie still couldn't make out, but he stabbed his finger at a giant rock, a piece of ledge jutting out from the soot-covered ground. Auggie ran to it and wedged his hands into a large crack across the top. He spread his legs for support and looked back at Elliot, who nodded and turned his attention to the salamander, which seemed somehow larger than before. He shouted something to it. It really was getting bigger. In Klingon, or whatever the language was, the salamander started glowing and opened its mouth wider. The flames from the surrounding brush started to flow into its mouth, slowly at first, then spiraling faster and larger, until it looked like a sort of orange tornado was forcing its way down its throat. The roar of the flames grew to a shriek, and Auggie felt himself being pulled towards the guy in his enormous salamander, which was now the size of... Auggie was a little too dazed to make comparisons. A bear, maybe? A compact car? He was really grateful that he was still wearing his county-issue work gloves, which were keeping his hands in place, and were probably the only thing keeping him from getting sucked up with the flames. The noise and wind grew almost unbearable, and the soot and ashes were so thick in the air that Auggie shut his eyes and clenched his face up as tight as possible, and rode out the storm for the minutes that it took to pass. After what seemed like 5, 7, 100 minutes or so, the roaring of the wind and the flames started to fade, and Auggie felt his weight settle back onto the rock. He slowly opened his eyes, one at a time, and looked around. It was still hot, no question about that, and there was smoke everywhere. But the flames were gone. Nothing was on fire. Elliot was kneeling on the ground, stroking the head and sides of his exhausted-looking salamander, which had shrunk back to its pre-flames size of hugeness. Auggie staggered to his feet and unhooked his canteen. He tried to hand it off to Elliot, but he was too focused on Bernice to notice him. He unscrewed the cap of the canteen and gulped down a couple of quick slugs of water, then slowly poured the rest over Elliot's head. This seemed to snap him, at least partially, out of whatever kind of trance he was in. He looked up and nodded his thanks to Auggie, then gestured to his equipment, which had started out as a neat pile next to the crate, but now was spread over quite a distance. He was still speaking whatever language he'd been using, but Auggie heard the words ampulla acque, which sounded a little like agua. So he went to the crate, now battered and scorched more than ever, and found a full-liter bottle of water, though truthfully at this point Auggie wouldn't have been surprised by a tap-dancing unicorn. He opened the bottle and took it back to Elliot, who nodded gratefully, gulped down about half of the water, and then poured the rest over the salamander's head and back. It looked up at Elliot with love, then collapsed limply along the ground. Off in the distance, Auggie was pretty sure he heard a bird chirp. Which, long story short, is how 15 months later, with time off for good behavior, Auggie found himself the first full-time employee of Salamander Solutions, a full-service environmental consulting and emergency rescue company. I'm trying to think of a drink that would be appropriate for after you've been fighting wildfires. Pina colada is not going to do it, neither is an old-fashioned, so we're going to go with something called a ranch water. And for this, I'm going to sacrifice our last peach. We've got a tree in our front yard that has a just overproduced peaches this year, and this is the very last one. But much like committing a crime of passion, we need to put down a drop cloth. Okay, now, if you look on the peach, you look at the top, there is a crease there. And you drive the prongs of a needle nose plier in there. You can just pull the pit out. And this is where the crime of passion happens. Into a large mixing glass or a cocktail shaker, you just squeeze the life out of that peach. It'll ooze out between your fingers. It'll be really unpleasant if you think about it, but it's all going to pull together. So, the spirit for this is Tonteo, jalapeno flavored tequila. Well, it's infused. It's not like artificial or anything. We're going to go with 3 ounces. Because, as we've said before, most fruits have esters, flavonoids, chemicals that are not water soluble, but are alcohol soluble. So, as much as we're stripping the peachiness away from the peach glop, the peach glop is also taking on some of that tequila. So we're going with a slightly larger amount of tequila than we normally would. Now, I don't know if there's any cocktail that is not appropriate for lime juice. But hey, we're talking peaches, we're talking tequila, we're even talking chilies, and lime, I think it's going to add just the right character there. Now, I don't know if you can tell, but I'm having a day. Trying to wipe the peach guts off of everything around me. Anyway, let's stir the fruit and tequila mixture. Give it a chance to interact. I don't use this cocktail shaker much, and in my mind, this was going to be just wide-mouthed and allow for easy pouring. I've also decided, I don't use it often, but I decided it was, what was it? Oh man, it really has been a day. Anyway, I decided I was going to break out the Foghorn Leghorn commemorative glass. That only comes out for very special occasions. And as you can see, I failed to account for the tiny pouring hole. It's actually just an air access hole. Okay, so let's just try to strain it more conventionally. And that's, I have to admit to being less than perfectly satisfied with that. Is anyone watching? Here. Since we're covered with peach glop anyway, we'll go old school on it. Now, the cool thing about ranch water, at its simplest, it's tequila and seltzer. Now we added a peach. We added some lime. But the seltzer, the club soda, the sparkling mineral water, that is possibly the most important element here. Hopefully you can find an extra bubbly one. Okay. I'm a firm believer in using a large straw for tall drinks. And this may be the most refreshing drink I've made in a while. Almost no sweetness to it at all. Just a little bit of residual sweetness from the peach that I used. It's good for sitting with my thoughts.